Okay, my clock shows 5 o'clock, so we will get started tonight. Thank you for joining our study session. It looks like Kathy will be logging on here shortly. I will call the meeting to order with roll call. Director Barrows.
Here.
And Director Smith.
Here.
And I am also here. And it looks like Kathy Decker.
I am here.
Perfect. We are all present and accounted for. So tonight, we have 2 action items. Well, the first thing on the agenda is citizen comments. We have no citizens signed up to speak tonight. So we will move on to our regular business. And our first item on the agenda is the recommendation to approve new mascot name for Columbia River High School. I want to thank Alex and team for putting together a couple more options for the board to consider. Do I have any motions?
I'll make a motion to move forward these 4 names for consideration.
Do I have a second?
Oh, second.
Okay, we can open it up to conversation. Does anyone have any thoughts? Just to review the name options, it is Purple Tide, Rapids, River, and Captains are the 4 options that the board could potentially move forward. And based on the names that we decide on tonight, or that we are comfortable with tonight, that we approve tonight, that will go back to the student body and they will make the final selection. Is there any thoughts or feedback about the 2 new additions, Purple Tide or Captains in particular?
I just want to again thank Mr. Odepal and the team for going back and doing it, especially when they were in the midst of starting school and starting in-person learning. I want to be careful about my terminology and bringing those kids back in the building. Thank you so much for adding just one more thing onto your list of things to do.
So I just wanted to add that the board has gotten some feedback on the name Captains. It was also, these 4 name options were presented in a Columbian article, and I received some community feedback while out and about this weekend. So I just wanted to ask for feedback from the other directors on Captains. The communication today was that perhaps there was historical context that wasn't as culturally sensitive. If anyone has thoughts or opinions on that.
All I would add to that, I saw that. I didn't get an opportunity to really read through it, given that it came in later on today. But what I will say is that I know that just in the couple of contacts that I have been able to develop among the local tribes, that was actually one of the options that one of the gentlemen had suggested. So I mean, again, every group is not a monolith of thinking, but captains can be a very broad term. So I find nothing objectionable about it.
I'm going to thank you, Kathy, because I was questioning my own memory, because I thought I had remembered that in our conversations when we met with the local tribes as well. And so I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's one of them that they had suggested, actually. So I appreciate you confirming my memory.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Kathy. I think I don't have any particular objections to captains.
Okay. Oh, Tracy.
Well, I was just going to say, I did have a chance to look through at least an email that I received, and I know there was concern about, certain captain figures, I'd have to look back at the email to know who it was, but I think in my mind, it's a more general term. I mean, I think, there might be good captains, there might be bad captains. it gave me pause, but I don't know that it's enough to, I'm not certain that I would want to remove it from the list. I would hope that perhaps as students are voting and as the information is kind of shared with the students as far as how to vote and thinking about a mascot, that might be a point of consideration. It's unfortunate that there's not enough time to kind of vet all of the connotations that the mascot options would have. I know our community or the committee has gone through that vetting process. So hopefully they have considered all of those connotations as well.
I would say if it were a specific captain, then that would be a concern, but it's just captains. I mean, we still have captains of football teams and captains of sports teams. So captains is actually, I think, considered in high regard, particularly among high school students.
Well, I appreciate all the feedback. I have to say I had a moment of pause like Tracy, just after reading the information and the feedback I got this weekend, but I do agree it's a profession, it's a general profession. And I think it's time to let the students decide. And I would like to give the students as many options as possible. So I look forward for this to be off the board's plate. But I do want to just reiterate to Alex and team, thank you for being patient as we have just wanted to get this right. I think we want this to be a lasting mascot that will stand the test of time. So that was the goal. So let's go ahead and move forward to a vote if no one else has anything to add. Director Barrows?
Approve.
Director Decker?
Approve.
Director Smith?
Approve.
And I also approve. Okay, the next item on the agenda is recommendations to approve a new mascot for Minnehaha Elementary School. This is a similar action in which we are approving or we are considering a slate of names that will then be taken back to the school for final selection. And the board received these a couple weeks ago, and the names, just to make sure I have this right, is Cedars, Mammoths, Martins, Mountains, and Rapids. Do I have a motion?
I will motion that we move these forward for the student population to vote on.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Is there any feedback or discussion for this?
I think these are all great. Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Tracy.
I was gonna say, I just feel like these are all great choices. I really appreciated having the context and kind of the meaning behind the names and kind of why they were chosen and how they meet the criteria. I felt like it was very clear to see, how these names represented our community in the Pacific Northwest and have kind of the rich traditions of the area. So I feel like these are all great.
And I'm just going to say my fingers are crossed for one in particular because I'm looking forward to seeing that costume come out of the closet.
So I just want to thank you for the information shared. I agree with Tracy. The context was very helpful in evaluating these names, but I think they look great. So we can move forward with a vote. Director Barrows?
Approve.
Director Decker?
Approve.
Director Smith?
Approve.
And I also approve. So all 5 of those names will move forward for consideration from the student body. The next item on the agenda is our board study session. And tonight we will be reviewing our early childhood inclusion preschool. So Kathy, I think Daniel's running point on this presentation. Okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Good afternoon, board members. For this afternoon's presentation, I'd like to introduce from Categorical Programs, Charlotte Pellens. and Chrissy Free, along with from Special Services, we have Laura Bergeron and Jamie Phelps. Before we get started, I just asked that we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation. If we could save questions to the end, that would be great. So let's go ahead and get started. Laura, if you want to start us off, please.
I would be happy to. So we're very proud of the work that we have done with our early learners in Vancouver Public Schools and with our plans for moving forward. And we thank you for the opportunity to share these with you tonight. Next slide. So VPS has taken on equity as a focus in the district, and our inclusive preschool model embodies equity because we are creating opportunities for students who are furthest from educational justice and for those with disabilities. Early learning has always been a focal point in Vancouver, and historically, we have served around 25 Title I students in the program at King every year. These students are 4 years old and they attend school for 3 days a week. For over 20 years, we have had early childhood special education classrooms in the district, serving more than 160 students a year, and these are 3- and 4-year-olds, but we've served them in a fully segregated, self-contained program. What I mean by that is that all of the students in these classrooms have been students with disabilities. In our K-12 continuum of services, we have had different options, but at the early childhood level, we have only had one option for students with disabilities. We knew that we needed to reimagine our programs and to expand learning opportunities for our students in order to prepare them for kindergarten and beyond. We needed to expand opportunities for our students who live within the district's 13 Title I schools who are not able to access a free preschool program such as Head Start or ECAP. And we really knew we needed to expand opportunities for our students with disabilities. So next slide, please. This is our framework. All students are general education students first, and being included with their peers provides them with a sense of belonging. Next slide. As I mentioned before, all of our early childhood special education programs that we had were for students with disabilities only. That was up until about 3 years ago, and we'll share more on that pilot program. The fact that we only had one program option for 3- and 4-year-old students with special needs was a problem. The state reviews data from districts around how much time students with special needs spend with their general education peers, and the federal government reviews that data at a state level. According to this data, in the 2017-18 school year, only 7.3% of our preschool students with disabilities were served with non-disabled peers, and the state's identified target was 29%. So we knew we needed to make a change, not just to meet the state's target, but because it's the right work for us to be doing. Research shows us that students gain tremendous benefits from being in an inclusive program. And that's for both the students with disabilities and those without disabilities. And inclusion helps our students to gain that sense of belonging and community that they don't gain from being in a segregated program. So with that context, I will turn it over to Jamie, and next slide, please.
So during our 3-year pilot with ESD 112, we created an inclusion preschool program that benefited all early learners and strengthened a sense of belonging for all students. Teachers co-taught and co-planned lessons to meet the needs of all learners. Teachers differentiated instruction and created lesson plans that scaffolded learning for ELL, special ed, and other students farthest from educational justice. An outcome of this 3-year pilot was a higher rate of students transitioning from this preschool program into their neighborhood school in VPS with kindergarten readiness skills. With all of the successes of this pilot, there were some obstacles in meeting the needs of all of the special education services in collaboration with ESD due to state guidelines around scheduling and the fact that the ESD preschool teacher was a non-certified staff member and didn't have the same level of training and support that our VPS teacher did. This led special services to look at how could we increase preschool opportunities in VPS for all students to create a sense of belonging and community. Next slide. This slide outlines the timeline and work completed to develop the inclusion preschool model within our district. Through the collaboration done last year, the VPS Early Learning Inclusion team wanted to capitalize on the hard work of the existing early learning programs within VPS and the lessons learned from the ESD 112 pilot to develop an inclusion preschool model that would support all early learners in VPS and create a sense of community and belonging for our youngest learners. And with that, Laura will continue our presentation with the next slide.
All of the planning for the new model was done in collaboration. Special education, categorical programs, and the district's early learning team, which included the early learning specialist and the King program teacher, were all invited to the table to partake in the conversation. The original plan we had developed was to roll the existing Title preschool program over into a blended program for the start of our current school year. However, the decision was made to provide the teacher in the program a longer runway to prepare, so that was pushed out to the start of the 21-22 school year. The planning team decided on the inclusive preschool model, and we'll talk to you about that more in depth in another slide or two. The team looked at other programs around the state and around the community. We reviewed different curriculum options, and we landed on the creative curriculum, which is a research-based curriculum appropriate for this age group, which also meets the Title I federal guidelines. The team developed a professional development plan, and it was created to assure that all staff working with our pre-K programs were trained and ready to go. And this year, they identified the TS Gold as an assessment option, which not only aligns to Title I guidelines, but it also aligns with the WA Kids assessment that our kindergarten teachers do. We also identified an eligibility framework to prioritize the Title I applicants, and Charlotte will tell you about that with the next slide.
Thanks, Laura. As Laura said, there are guidelines for district Title I funded preschools that must be followed. An important guideline is student identification. As you can see here, there's a clear educationally related criteria for eligibility. Next slide. In addition to the criteria on the last slide, there are children who are automatically eligible for inclusion. We currently reserve spaces in the inclusion preschool for students who meet this automatic eligibility criteria. Chrissy will continue our presentation. Next slide.
We continued the work this year. In August 2020, all preschool teachers received training on using creative curriculum and early learning research-based curriculum aligned to Washington State early learning standards. The expectations is for preschool teachers to fully implement creative curriculum. We started this school year opening 2 inclusion preschool classrooms at Ogden. Due to the COVID restrictions, when we began to bring students into hybrid, we needed an additional room, and we had to move 1 classroom to King. Time is set aside for inclusion teachers to meet monthly and receive professional development. Examples have been co-teaching, early learning standards, social emotional learning, assessment, and report cards. The importance of this work is to prepare students for their kindergarten experience. Next slide, please.
So you can see from this slide that we have made good progress in our work reimagining how students can increase their sense of community. As you see in the data that's presented here, we have increased the opportunities for our students who are furthest from educational justice to have a preschool opportunity, increasing the number of Title students served by about 200%. And we've also opened this up to 3-year-olds as well. We have increased the opportunity for our students with disabilities to be included with their peer group. And next slide. Our plans for next year will increase this even more. Next slide. So I'm a visual person. So this is the visual of the last 2 slides. As you can see in the first group, we're showing the 3-year time span from 2019 through the end of the next school year. We started out serving around 25 students, and by the end of the next school year, we'll be serving 84. Students served in an inclusion program, or I should say students with disabilities, will increase from 36 last year to 84 at the end of next year. And the last group of bars is my favorite. And this is the number of students with disabilities who are served in self-contained programs. We started last year with 147, and by the end of next year, we will be down to 84 students. And we think that is amazing. Next slide, please.
So we are very proud that we are providing free preschool opportunities for children who would not have access if our inclusion program did not exist. VPS has created a preschool model that increases early learning opportunities for students who are the farthest from educational justice. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you.
Back one.
Thank you. This is a slide that really outlines our inclusion preschool model. We developed this model by collaborating with other districts and early learning programs in Southwest Washington and Oregon. VPS developed a strong inclusion preschool model based on research and best practices. We reviewed the best practices for class size published by the National Institute of Early Education Research, Washington State, and the Early Learning Challenge Technical Program. All of these resources recommended a class size of 20 students per session or fewer with a ratio of 10 students per adult. Our programs have 21 students per session and a ratio of 10 students per adult. Our programs have the additional staffing of 2 para-educators per classroom to increase the adult support or adult to student ratio above research recommendations. The VPS Early Learning Inclusion team also reviewed recent research on inclusion program models. This research was authored by the Council for Exceptional Children, the Department of Education, and the Early Learning Challenge Technical Assistance Program. This team was also researched comparable inclusion preschool programs in both Oregon and Washington. After reviewing all of this research and collaborating with our neighboring districts, we were able to identify that all of our programs in our area, and including in Oregon, have some common characteristics that we knew were best practiced, were encompassed best practices and current research. And some of those characteristics include 50-50 split of students taught by 2 teachers, fully implementing creative curriculum in TS Gold, parent training and collaboration, ongoing training and support for inclusionary practices for all staff, and class sizes between 18 and 21 students per session. Our early learning inclusion team combined this research and with the best practices of our neighboring schools districts to develop our inclusion preschool model. With that, Laura will continue our presentation.
Next slide, please. Thanks. The work of our earliest learners is so exciting. And we've talked a lot about equity and how it relates to our preschool program. Next slide. So because of the great work we've been doing with our preschoolers, many of our preschool students with disabilities will step into a supported kindergarten program that works to include students who need a little extra help. By the end of the year, these students will spend most of their day in a general education kindergarten program. And this sets the work for the foundation for all of their education with Vancouver Public Schools. We've also begun working on our inclusive practices at the K-12 level. We're partnering with the ESD to support inclusive work at the elementary level, and we've partnered with OSPI on an inclusionary pilot program at the middle and high school levels. We know that this is a good start and that we have a long way to go. The culture of our district needs to shift in order to see special education as a service, not a location. And we believe that we're up to that challenge. So I'm going to turn it back to Daniel.
So I'd like to thank the team for the work they've done. And I now turn it over to the board members for any questions for the team.
Thank you all for that presentation. That was really helpful. I am going to open it up to questions if anyone wants to get going.
I can ask a question. And background, as a school psychologist in a neighboring district that has these inclusion models, I have And I was the school psychologist for the early childhood special ed program for about 9 years. I have seen the success that the inclusion model has had and the opportunity that it gives some of our preschool students. I guess my biggest question is around the replacement of the previous preschool program and kind of the thinking around, and I know other board members, I think, probably have the same question of why replace this great program with another great program? Why not have both great programs?
That's a really good question. I think I'm going to jump in on that one. So I know you have this history, Tracy, but in 1954, the Supreme Court decided that students could not be segregated based on the color of their skin. And students with disabilities didn't have the same rights offered them until 20 years later with the passing of Public Law 94-142, which said that we could no longer segregate against students with disabilities. And yet we continue to segregate students with disabilities. It's happening so much so across the country and within the state that the state OSPI has made it a focus. So much so that they have changed the funding structure of special education to better support or provide more funds for students who are spending 80% to 100% of their day in a general education environment. So when you ask, why can't we have both? I guess the question I hear is, why would we need both? Why would we want a separate classroom that didn't welcome in students with disabilities?
I'm sorry, Laura, I just have to stop you there because the implication that you are stating, and I promised that I would wait until the end to speak, but the implication that you are stating there is that the current program offered at King does not include children with disabilities or ELL students. And that is a gross misrepresentation of the work that is being done at that King program. So while I understand that this is a more designed 50-50 split, I also know that the program at King does not exclude children with disabilities, nor does it exclude children with ELL. As a matter of fact, I know that in addition to allowing children with disabilities to be in the classroom on IEPs, that the current teacher also helps to identify students as they come in who are unidentified. So if you could restate that a little bit.
So Kathy,
so that we're not misrepresenting what the current program does, please.
I don't think, and again, to restate, I don't believe that if that's how it was interpreted, that's not the way we were attempting to deliver that. It's more about creating even more opportunities. We understand that King was doing work around supporting students with special needs. This is about creating more opportunities at the table for more students to even have that opportunity to benefit from being with their peers. So again, not to minimize the great work that's been done out at King in the Title I program, to say that they weren't providing services as you just described. This is an opportunity, once again, to really give all students the opportunity to be part of a community. And that's where we're coming at. This isn't to say anybody was doing anything not well. It was to embrace the great work and to make it even greater for more students. I hope that helps, Kathy.
I appreciate the clarification. I just know that in addition to the board members listening, we also have a number of people listening in, and I want to make sure that there was no opportunity for people to misconstrue what the offerings is at King.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I actually have a similar question to what Tracy asked, but I have a lot of questions that are focused on this new program model. So I kind of want to start there just so I can learn more about it. I absolutely support the work you're doing, and I thank you because it's interesting in our superintendent search interview process. our conversation really oriented around early childhood education quite a bit. We had some really, really just insightful conceptual conversations about the important role that early childhood education plays on K through 12 success. So it was very top of mind from our conversations last month. So I looked forward to learning more about what we're going to do. I absolutely support expanding our early childhood education model, and I love the inclusion. So I'm on board with all of that. Some of the details are a little harder for me to get, and so that's why I'm asking these questions. I'm not an early childhood education expert. I have a marketing degree, so but I think the class size is hard for me to get my head around. Having toured preschools, I looked at about 15 in total when I was making a selection for my own kids. I never saw a classroom with more than about 12 kids. So I'm struggling to get my head around 21 kids of mixed developmental age. There's a big difference between 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And then on top of that, we would have 50% special needs. So I guess I'd love to know more about the research supporting the 21 kids in the classroom.
Yeah, I can start that conversation, Kyle, and answer your question. So we did review research around what was the recommended class size. So the state of Washington, if you are getting credentialed for a private preschool, they recommend 20 students and a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 students per adult in the room. So that was the guidance from the state. And then we looked further into the research that's being done specifically for inclusion and special education preschool, because again, we want to base all of our programming here on the best research we can to support students so they can get the skills they need for kindergarten. And again, there's that model of no more than 20. Now we have 21, but that goes with our VPS preschool teacher contract that we have had in place for our preschool teachers for the last contract cycle. So it's one more than what is typically recommended, but to offset that, we then staff each program with 2 classroom paras. So we're increasing the adult to student ratio beyond what the research says. So we're very thoughtful about that. I mean, my goal always is, if I could, I'd have the classroom size smaller than that, but we really did look to the research to make sure that we were in alignment.
Can I just ask about what you were just saying about in order to be credentialed? That's, I don't mean to counter you, but I know that at all of the private preschools private preschools I've worked at, including the one I currently work at, we are not allowed to be over 14 by state law. So, and that's with 2 adults in the room. We have a state licensure that comes through to check to make sure that we do not have more than 14 in the room. I currently have 3-year-olds. So I'm kind of in a conundrum how we have to have only 14, but you're saying 21 is okay. I must say, I'm very confused.
Well, sorry, Laura, do you want to? Okay. I can only speak to what I've read in my research. Again, when we partnered with ESD 112, which I know they have to do the same kind of licensure, we had 19 students per session with 2 teachers, and we had 2 paras in that space as well. So again, I mean, in our partnerships with ESD 112, and they have to follow the same guidelines, we were in compliance. And again, that's for private preschool. Again, we're just looking at that research. We're also looking at the research that's been done around best practice for class size for preschool, and also then honoring our current teacher contract for preschool teachers.
I have to say that I'm still, I am confused by the differences in the class size requirements, because I do know wherever I've worked and wherever I've sent my kids, and the state law that I am familiar with, the WAC codes, 14-2 is the apps. I mean, you can lose your license.
Kathy, I'll just add on. I mean, from my experience in Evergreen with our preschools, I mean, that's what our inclusion classrooms were.
Or what?
About 20 students and a teacher, one general ed teacher, one special ed teacher, and then like paras, 2 or 3 paras.
So, and
So
maybe it's the support staff that are
yeah,
working
it's
on that.
very, yeah, and we're not allowed to have more than 20 kids total, no matter what. So anyway, okay.
So I'm just gonna kind of go through my list of questions. So I'm curious about metrics for how are we going to measure the success of this program? Like what I'm a data person, so kind of what are the benchmarks we're going to use to kind of measure our success with this new model?
I'll jump in. Jamie, you can jump in behind me if you need to. So for our students with disabilities, we would always be measuring based on their IEP goals and the progress that they make on those goals. And then with our, for the whole class, we have developed a report card that is also based on the creative curriculum. But then we also have COSEF data, and I can never remember what COSEF stands for. It's for the outcomes when students are leaving early childhood. And this is actually data obtained by the state. So it's all documented, and it measures whether or not students are leaving the program ready for kindergarten. So we would be able to use that data as well.
The other thing that we realized is that we needed to have an embedded assessment that we could utilize for all students in the preschool program. So after identifying creative curriculum, which again is used by Head Start, ECAP, it's aligned with early learning standards for the state of Washington. We also wanted to find an assessment that aligned with those standards so we could see progress over time. And so we identified TS Gold as the assessment that we are going to use. Again, that is used by Head Start and ECAP also to be able to monitor progress in their programs. And we are going to purchase that, train all of our preschool staff, and fully implement that next year. So we'll be able to see where students started in our program and where they were at the end of the year based on early learning standards.
Thank you. So I love that you are setting aside time monthly for professional development. This seems like a hard educator job. I'm going to be honest. You know, to have 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, 50-50, the inclusive model. I'm just curious, like, what's the experience level of the teachers we have now? And, you know, who are we looking for to fill these positions, or have we filled these positions?
Yeah, I can start that, and then Christy can chime in if I'm missing anything, because she's my partner in the Title I side. We've been really lucky. Initially, when we decided to open our own VPS inclusion model this year, I was able to take the special ed teacher who had already been co-teaching with the ESD 112 teacher and had a lot of experience. We actually hired her from New York, and she had inclusion preschool experience from New York. So we were very lucky that we got a really great candidate. She came to VPS, and then we hired a Title I teacher who had experience teaching kindergarten and was very aware of those early learning standards. And so we partnered the two of them, and Jacqueline was able to mentor and support the teacher in the co-teaching model along with the professional development that we offered. So that was the one program. The other program we have, we have a full-time sub, but luckily for me, I worked with her before, and she did an inclusion preschool and kindergarten program. So she came to us through that SPED lens of really valuing co-teaching, co-planning, and differentiating for students. And then our Title I teacher also came to us from Alaska, and she taught preschool in Alaska and was very knowledgeable. So in our 2 programs that we currently have, we were really lucky to recruit individuals who already had experience, and then we could then just further support their growth and being able to do that co-teaching. Because you're right, Kyle, that's the piece I think that is like the most challenging sometimes, because teachers teach sometimes in isolation, right? We teach our own groups and we feel very confident with that, but then it's really working as a team to meet the needs of all students. And that takes sometimes professional development. It also takes that day of planning to do really thoughtful lesson plans that meet the needs of all students. And so I'm so thankful that we have those Mondays embedded in their week so that they can do that crosswalk cross planning together so that it sets the whole week up for success.
So those are the 4 teachers the educators that will be moving forward next year as well.
Yeah, and well, we are currently opening a new inclusion preschool program at Truman after spring break. And so I just hired the special ed teacher on Friday. And I was very lucky because we had a part-time special ed teacher at our evaluation center who's already been evaluating and partnering with families and a team. And she came to us from Portland and she taught an inclusion preschool model for 5 years, I believe it was, in Portland. And so she's taught creative curriculum, she's done TS Gold, she's very confident in co-teaching. So I was excited when I could offer her the position to transition to Truman because she already had that knowledge base. And then Chrissy just hired the Title I teacher, and she could speak a little bit more to the credentials and the qualifications of that person.
Yes. So we too just hired our Title I teacher that will be working with Elizabeth. She's coming from Oklahoma and has experience in early learning as well, and is also certified in dual language as well, which will also benefit our students who are EL.
Thank you. I think that's most of my questions about this model. Wendy, do you have anything?
I want to thank everybody for their work. This is just, it's wonderful to hear about, honestly. I'm very excited to hear about the work you guys have been doing. And I think I just want to say, like, how incredibly valuable for our students that we would identify as our more mainstream students, not the students with learning or with disabilities, but the other half of this class, right? Like, what a gift to give them in their experiences too. And so I think it's wonderful. So thank you everybody for all of your work. I don't really have a lot of questions. I think maybe because, like Tracy, I mean, I don't have the background that Tracy does, but I work in a district where this has been going on. So I'm at least a little bit familiar with what it looks like and how it works. And I certainly have talked to a fair number of those teachers in Evergreen anyway, doing this kind of work. So I have at least a little bit of familiarity, though not firsthand. I just have a couple of questions that are kind of tangentially related. So I apologize. I'm curious, and this is more kind of a Deborah Hale question while we're on the topic of preschool, and then we can go back to the inclusion thing. I'm just curious, we had some additional preschool programs that we were doing, like the evening preschool thing, and there were some plans that I'm afraid might have fallen by the wayside after schools got shut down last year about bringing the students who turn 5, you know, in the spring and giving them some preschool opportunities before kindergarten. And I'm just curious, like, are those things still happening? Is that still something that's in the works?
Hi Wendy, it's Deborah. I only see you now in a little thumbnail, so I wanted to reintroduce myself. I will tell you that we're on hold right now with that, and partly because evening preschool has always been a family engagement activity as well as a student early learning activity. And we are not quite where we can embrace and invite those families into our schools. And, you know, our custodians and all of our building operator work is happening at night after the kids go home. And so we have talked about it. I just want you to know it hasn't slipped off our radar, but we are on hold for the moment. We still have some K teachers out there who are saying, hey, you know what, we've got an interest in this. Is there some way we can do this later in the year? And we know that's quickly becoming a short window. We're not going to rule it out quite yet because guidance seems to change, you know, frequently. And if our guidance gets to a slightly different place, it would still be a really, we think, a wonderful thing to offer toward the end of the school year. So that's where it is right now. Did I answer that okay? Or
you
no?
did. I was afraid that that's what you were going to say.
I know. And we really tried to figure out the go forward on it. And what we came back to was not right this second, but we're not even saying a no, we're saying a not yet. And we certainly have the resources thanks to a lot of different revenue streams. We've got the resources. If we don't utilize those resources this spring, they will be there for every teacher next fall and student next fall.
Right. Well, I appreciate you filling us in. The update, I appreciate that. I was afraid that that might what have happened. But I guess I want to take this opportunity to say I still strongly support those programs. They were experiencing so much success, and I just want to make sure that because of everything that's happened in the last year, that we don't forget about those successes and that we bring them back as soon as we're able to.
I appreciate that. Thank you for remembering them. And yes, absolutely, they're at the top of our list to come back. Thanks.
So I apologize. We kind of veered off the subject, but while we were talking about preschool, I wanted to make sure that.
Yeah. Thanks, Wendy. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions about our new preschool model? Because I have some tangential questions too, and I wanted to kind of address that separately.
So I was waiting because I know that I have a, I don't know. People
You're
know me
passionate.
to have a lot of questions and to be passionate about certain things. So before I ask any questions and before I say anything, I want to give anybody that doesn't know my personal background an insight into why, well, partly why this is an important piece for me. I have 18 years of teaching experience. Before I had kids, this is the piece where those of us who work in education have always been aware of the pendulum swing. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, believe it or not, we were doing project-based learning and standard-based assessment and full inclusion, not just preschool, but inclusion at the elementary level and the high school level. And I was lucky enough to have worked in those experiences. I was lucky enough to have been a part of an elementary school in Corvallis that was part of a University of Oregon Reinvent Schools research project. And if there was a new thing on the docket, we were doing it. We did multi grades, we did project-based learning, we did standard-based assessment, we did full-on inclusion. And by full-on inclusion, I mean the speech specialist, the ELL teacher, the LAP teacher, the special education teacher, they were all push in. There were almost no pull outs. It was all push in. That's what we call it now. Then we called it full-on inclusion. So it was amazing. And to see this come back around, I will have to say that when I left teaching, because I had the opportunity to stay at home with my own kids, and my kids went back to school, and somehow all of this amazing inclusion opportunities had been erased and kids were being served outside of their own classrooms, it broke my heart. So I am incredibly passionate about an inclusion model, and not just at the preschool. I am also passionate about early childhood learning. I have been a preschool teacher for a number of years, almost 10 now. And I kind of fell into it after having taught elementary school. And it is so dynamic and so amazing what early childhood learning does for families and for kids. And so when I ask these questions, I want you to understand that I fully support a program that has high quality early childhood for all. One of my sticking points, and Jamie, we went through this already, that 21, I cannot possibly wrap my head around it. I understand that it's being done in some other places, but to me, it is, that is a lot of kids. And I don't care how many other adults you put in the room, that is a lot of kids in one room. And we're not here to debate the nitty gritty, and so I'm not going to debate it, but I want it out there that 21 in a classroom, especially in a school district that prides itself on having small class size. We don't even have 21 kindergartners in a Title I class, or at least we try not to. Now we're putting 21 preschoolers in a Title I preschool with 50% Title I kids and 50% special needs. That gives me pause. And we don't have to, like I said, you don't need to debate it. I just want you to know that that weighs very heavy as a board director and as a strong supporter of high, again, not just early learning, not just inclusive preschool, but high quality preschool for all. 21, ooh, that just makes me very nervous. The starting with 50-50. I'd like to hear more. I won't use our time here, or maybe we should use our time here. I do know that when you are talking, particularly when you're talking about Title I areas, you, even as a kindergarten teacher in a Title I school, you get kids that walk through that door who are unidentified at the age of 5. So now you're pulling in, you're saying we're starting with 50% identified already, and we're pulling in the other 50% of these kids from Title I families. The chances that the rest of those kids coming in are, that some of them are not going to be identified, I hazard a guess that at least 25% of them are going to be identified, because that's been my life experience. So now we're going to more 30 general ed, 70 special ed. So what do we do when we get to that number? Because that's a whole different flip-flop.
So
I know that there are programs out there that start 30 special ed and 70 general, knowing that you'll probably identify. So
I can, okay, absolutely, Kathy. And I just appreciate your thoughtful questions, because I know we both are extremely passionate about early learning, and we want these programs.
Thank you for recognizing that passion and not aggression.
I know. And when we met in June to talk about inclusion, I knew that you feel equally passionate about the topic. So let me address the model, and then Chrissy can partner with me on addressing what do we do as, and this is one of the beautiful things about this program and the King program, is that we can identify those students early that need extra support. It's a built-in child find for these families, which is something I'm extremely passionate about. The 50-50 model, we researched several different models that are in research-based for inclusion. And I also reached out to my colleagues in neighboring districts, like Evergreen does a 50-50 model. Our pilot program with ESD was a 50-50 model. I reached out to U of O to find out what their model was, and they were doing a 50-50 model as well throughout Lane County. A very similar process of screening non-identified students for risk factors that were not able to access Head Start or other free preschool options, and creating an inclusive preschool for them. So for my value system, because I care so deeply about early learning, is what model was research-based that would allow us to serve the most students. Because we have so many students in our community that don't have access to preschool. Their families can't pay for private preschool, and they don't qualify for Head Start or ECAP. So we have this pool of students in our community that are not getting access to services. And so my passion is, how do I find the research to do a model that is really going to support those learners who would not have access otherwise? And we really landed on the 50-50 model for that reason. But we early on identified in this process that exactly what you said, Kathy, is that we're going to get kids coming in that no one has ever had eyes on before, and they have not been identified, and they're going to need extra support. And we're going to realize that really quickly. So Chrissy and I and the inclusion preschool team came up with a solution before we even did the program here in VPS. And so I'll let her speak to that.
So thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Kathy. I too can echo your passion for this. As Jamie mentioned, we really did do a lot of research behind this, and knowing that we are going to identify some students through that child find process, we do not necessarily start with a 50-50 model with 50% SPED and 50% title. We do start with 50% title, knowing that we are going to get some child find, and through the identification process, we may transfer those students over into the special ed side to develop that 50-50 model. So as you mentioned, it may start in the fall with more of a 30% SPED with 50% of it filled with title students. And we continue to keep the 50% for that title student so that we can keep that inclusion process across the board consistent.
And Chrissy, would you also speak to the screening process that will be part of the identification of our title students?
Sure. So in order to meet the Title I federal guidelines, we do have to have eligibility for students to be in our Title I inclusion program. So we do have students, families, they fill out an ASQ, a modified ASQ for us to identify students most in need, at risk, and we rank order those students, and they get the opportunity to participate in the program first. And we continue to keep a wait list based upon when an opening comes open, we are able to fill those slots. Just as Jamie mentioned, we are going to be opening up that program in April. And so that's where we are able to fill those Title I slots, is we have students that are on that wait list who are ready and willing to start in April.
And so you screen them with ASQ?
We do a modified ASQ for the Title I. And with the COVID restrictions right now, that's how we have to do that process.
Okay.
And is that gonna be any different next school year when we're hopefully out of COVID?
Yes, when we are out of COVID, Jamie and I have really done a lot of research in regards to this too, and we want it to align. And Tracy, you had mentioned being a school psychologist with that process. We are going to incorporate with our child find, with our early learning evaluation center. We are going to do the same process that is done at our early evaluation center. So it aligns consistently from 3 all the way through the process. So when we get out of COVID, we will have the ASQ test, and then we will bring students in to do an additional screener, so we have additional information.
So what happens if somehow you end up with like 60% of special ed students? Do you try and keep it balanced? Do you move things? I mean, how will you end up when all of a sudden it's like, well, that was, you know, a dark horse. We didn't realize that their being quiet was hiding something else, or that these kids. So how will you keep that balance?
So we will always have, because as you know, Kathy and Tracy, you can speak to this too, through Child Find, we're obligated then to provide services for that student.
Right.
So we'll still have ECSE spots available to support the students. But our first goal is always to have opportunities in the 50-50 model and to grow that as much as students come forward and we find them. Because again, the program that we've talked about today, it goes without saying, it benefits all of the students.
Well, and I was gonna add on, just because I've literally seen it happen, and my job was to place kids into these classrooms. And, you know, again, it's in a different system. So, you know, Daniel and Chrissy, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, day one in August, you're not starting with 21 students. You're starting with 10 or 11, you know, students who are not on IEPs, and you might have like 4 kids who are on IEPs, because you have to keep those places open. I mean, that's the nature of preschool, where kids get identified through the year and the classes fill up. So you're not at your caseload in August, you're at your caseload in the spring.
Correct.
So those spots are saved. For, you might start with like 14 kids. And so as kids get identified through Child Find and the screening process, those spots fill up. And if one of those peers that's not on an IEP gets identified, they they basically take one of those spots for kids on IEPs, and would you guys open up to, you know, get more, you know, if now you only have 8 kids that are not on IEPs because 2 kids have been identified, you would maybe pull in more registration. So you're
Correct.
always keeping that,
Correct.
that
So
10
you
to
didn't
11.
start the year
No.
with 21 kids in each
No.
No,
class?
Typically,
And
Go ahead.
I'm talking about specifically this year, you didn't start with 21 kids.
no.
No.
And right now, for example, I mean, this is kind of low numbers, Kathy, but
Yeah, it's
It-
COVID, so we're
yeah.
low numbers at my
we're low.
preschool too.
Yeah, we're low across the board right now. But for example, the one that we just opened, or we're in the process of opening at Truman, I think we have 5 title students, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, this is from memory, 5 title students in one session and 6 in the other. And then we have only 1 special ed student in each session. So we start it small. I mean, this is lower than it would normally be, Kathy, but that just gives you an example of our inclusion preschools we were identifying students, especially through that birth to 3 transition, that
Right.
really only had, you know, goals in one area or 2 areas. And then we needed to develop and expand our preschool option.
I do have to say that we are being cognizant of some influx that we're going to see with COVID, kind of the doors opening as far as the new guidelines that we're receiving. We're seeing a beginnings of, and Tracy, you're probably seeing this in Evergreen too, is that we're starting to see early learners starting to come in and ask to be screened for services. So that's why we're we already know that this is a possibility to happen. So that's why we're beginning the stages of opening up this additional program at Truman. So yeah, it's a constant looking at and making sure that we're meeting the specific needs of all of the students. Again, it's about creating those opportunities for students to be a partner in that community.
Yeah.
And now, not so much question, but the taking off my early learning passion and putting on my very heavy these days board member hat here. I want to speak to the process. And so here's some process concern. Is that okay if Kyle, did you have any?
No. I kind of wanted to focus on the model first, but it seems like we've exhausted those questions.
Okay,
so
I just want to make sure there aren't any other questions, right? So as a board member, here are my observings, my thoughts, my ponderings, whatever you want to name them, whatever the newest name is for them these days. 1, as a board member, I found this out because I found out about this new preschool program because I follow Ogden, obviously, because that's where I was. I follow Ogden, and in February or March of 2020, they were advertising this new program. I'm like, whoa, that hasn't come over our desk. So as a board member who has to approve every new book that is added into a classroom, that is added to the curriculum, I ask myself, and no need to answer, I ask myself, why, when we're developing an entirely new program, which it really is, were we not read in at the beginning of the program? That just seems counterintuitive to me. I have to approve, if a teacher wants a new book, second grade teacher wants a new book, I have to say, yes, that's okay. But an entirely new program with all of the rearranging of funding that goes with it, I find out from Facebook. Seems a little off to me. Second, also off to me is because the funding is so complicated on this, and to be honest with you, I'm not even sure why this funding for this program is much different from the funding from the current program. Again, as a board member, I wonder, why weren't we read into the realignment of funds for this program? We one of our primary responsibilities is to make sure that funding it is done well and is done equitably and makes sense, and that we understand it. So that also it didn't come to us in that way either. And in the sense that the presentation was awesome. Jamie, I know we connected the first time we met and we reconnected again. Your passion is palatable even on Zoom. Not to say your others aren't, but there's a definite connection here. I am concerned that the only people presenting tonight, or that seem to have been involved, were from categorical, and there were none from early learning. We actually have an early learning specialist in the district, and where that person, whether it was in 2020 or this year, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that this is the only, if this is the preschool option we are using, that somehow the early learning specialist is not a part of the team. That seems, again, counterintuitive to me. So those are just my wonderings. Those are my concerns. As a board member, how are we how is our district working together? And why is the board not being informed when these things are coming on board?
So I'm just going to take a quick follow up from there, because I just want to give a little background. I was unaware of most all of this because I don't live in the world of early childhood education. But
it's so much fun. Come join us.
It is. Well, I have young children, so I guess I have exposure that way. But we started as a board, getting communication about 5 weeks ago about the transition of this new program. And I think that was kind of the impetus for the conversation tonight. And again, I want to reiterate, I love the presentation. I appreciate all the effort of enabling this discussion, because this is what I kind of envisioned. And this is what I was explaining to Kathy Everidge is this new program, it looks great, but the communication that the board has been receiving is really about the cancellation of the current program. So it's the board trying to, I think, I don't want to speak for everyone, but trying to kind of reconcile what we're hearing from constituents, from families, from educators, about the ending of an existing program that has been very successful. Their confusion, there's some anger, there's some hurt. I will say that the communications have ramped up over the last couple of weeks, and somehow my cell phone number is now out there, and I've received a lot of phone calls in the last 5 days or so. And there's a lot of, I'm just going to be honest, there's a lot of emotion around this. Kendra built a fantastic program at King, and there's a lot of support there. So for me as a board member, I'm just trying to reconcile the new program looks good and I'm excited about it, but the existing program that has been so successful and was built by an early childhood learning specialist. And so what I asked Kathy about, I said, is there a way that we can have a both and conversation? And I think that's where Tracy started us off. But I think particularly because, Kendra built the program based on kindergarten readiness, and she met her metrics and made some huge improvements and has a huge following now. Is there a way that we can continue that 3-day-a-week preschool program? I'm asking the question, just not to say that it would in any way jeopardize what we're doing now, but I mean, based on the community feedback, there's a lot of families that are concerned about their lack of access because they have, every sibling, for instance, has gone through the King program. So I kind of wanted to just get your input on, you know, is it an either or? Can it be a both and? I know that it's a very complicated funding. I'm just curious.
And if I could ask, particularly because we don't, I'm excited about the possibilities of this inclusion program, but we don't have the data yet back because of the wackadoodle COVID year that we've spent. It would be nice, and we do have exceptional data from the 10-year program that has been in place at King. And the long-term data too, as to how it's affected third graders and their iReady tests. So is there a way that while we're gathering the data around this one, and that we can come back to the community and say, this program is also exceptional? Can we do, like Kyle said, a both and?
And this is a bigger conversation, so I recognize that. I just, I will tell you that a lot of the feedback was fairly consistent from the parents. I received really beautiful messages from so many different families that have graduated from Kendra's program, who are in it now. Really thoughtful, but it was, the anger part really came from a communication standpoint of not being engaged or not being aware that this conversation was happening, not being aware that this transition was happening. So I think there's just this abrupt realization of, oh my gosh, this program is ending this year. So that's why I'm throwing it out there as a conversation point and an evaluation, not to deter what the work we're doing going forward with inclusion model. I support everything you presented tonight. It's just the loss of a program, you know, Washington State Teacher of the Year in 2016 and all the other benefits that she adds to our district.
Can I weigh in or kind of build on that thought, Kyle? I think that there is probably a lot of disappointment because Kendra is phenomenal. Everybody loves Kendra, and she is absolutely deserving of everyone's love. She's amazing, and she is definitely a gift to our district. And so I think there's probably a lot of disappointment there with families, especially families with older siblings that went through her program, but that's not an opportunity for her. But I also am really struggling with this conversation, frankly, because this is an issue of equity. And there's also a lot of anger, frankly, when someone feels like they're getting, like something's being taken away from them that they feel that they deserve. And so my question, I'm going to push back on that thought a little bit. My question is, why isn't the inclusion program, the inclusion preschool for these families? So we have a wonderful program that's been put together. Based on your presentation, we've had a 3-year pilot of this program, right?
But the pilot was an ESD model. It's a little different.
But that's what this is built on, right? So, and we participated in that pilot, correct? Did I understand that correctly? So this isn't something that we've just thrown together, and it's clearly they had a lot of thought put into it. But I'm really struggling with the idea of we need to have, you know, a regular preschool program.
But it's not regular. It's not, and that was my point. And it's not this intense program that they presented, but that was my point at the beginning when we started, why I interrupted, sorry, Laura, was because Kendra's program, I hesitate to call it Kendra's program, although she did develop from the ground up, but the King model, we'll take a person out of it and just call it the program. The King model does include kids with IEPs and does include ELL, and it is Title I. So it's,
of course it does. Of course it does.
Right.
So it's a regular classroom, right? That's what regular classrooms have, all of those kind of learners in.
But in a more intense sort of way because of the community that it serves.
Sure, I understand that. And maybe I'm coming from a place where that's where I teach, is that type of community, and my children go to that kind of, so that's, I guess that's my familiarity anyway. But my point is, like, I am very hesitant to say we need to have this program for these families and this program for these families, when we can just have a program that everybody can access, and everyone benefits from in frankly a very beautiful way. And so I'm I'm struggling with that concept, frankly. Well, yeah, but we can keep this one going for the families who are uncomfortable with the inclusion preschool, frankly.
I don't think they were uncomfortable with the inclusion. They're not uncomfortable with the inclusion preschool. They were taken aback because they were not communicated with.
Fair enough. And absolutely, I'm always for increased communication, as much communication as we can handle.
Yes.
And I acknowledge that there are a lot of families, like I said, who have older siblings that went through that program and they wanted that same experience for their younger children. I get that. They have a personal connection to that program. But let's be honest, let's be frank, there are also some families who are disappointed because now what we're offering is an inclusion preschool model, and that makes them uncomfortable. And I can say that because I've worked with those teachers, frankly, who don't want to work in an inclusion classroom.
So the families that we have heard from, that has not been.
I think it's unfair for us to pretend that that's not part of it. So.
Well, I will say that is not, none of the families that I have talked to is that an issue.
Well, so I'm going to just
that is not the issue that the parents are concerned about.
Well, so Wendy, I really thank you for, I appreciate the comment, because I think that it's, I mean, your feedback. I like discussion. I like these kind of thoughtful discussions. So I appreciate it. I will say, I 100% see your point. Most of the parents I have talked to, it's concerned that they would no longer be eligible for, that there wouldn't be enough spots, or that they wouldn't have access to the program. There was a lot of frustration about lack of communication, lack of definition around what the needs-based
and lack of answered questions is. Yeah, and lack of answered questions where they've actually sent questions and not gotten answers back. So
I mean, if I could just real quickly, communication, we can always be better at communication. So I'll be the first one to say that we're never, I never think we're perfect at that. We can always be better at communicating. What I do want to suggest though is, doesn't matter if it's a King program or a PSO program, a Truman program, all of the students have to fit within the requirements under Title I in order to access that program, because it's an extra layer of support for that basic ed student, or that student, that general ed student. So again, we've been saying Kendra's program, but the program that she developed, that was designed out at King, still had to meet those Title I requirements. So that's not going to change, because we're using, as someone, I think it was Kathy, you talked about the blending of funding. And when we use Title I funds, they come with regulations attached to them. Just like IDA funds come attached, as Tracy can speak to, come with very specific regulations. So those haven't changed from this year, last year, or the year before that. Those regulations are in place that we shared in our slide presentation. So I just wanted to put that out there.
You know what, this just brings up, and I apologize, one other quick question. There was a statement, one of the slides said something about we would be able to serve children that wouldn't otherwise be eligible. And that confused me. I mean, obviously all of these kiddos have to be eligible one way or another in order for the funding. How is it that we're serving kids that wouldn't have been eligible previously? That was very confusing to me.
So let me Go ahead,
Sorry.
Laura.
So I
No,
think the
please.
slide said that the students who wouldn't otherwise be eligible for, say, a Head Start or an ECAP that
Right.
prioritizes based on family income. And what Charlotte outlined were the guidelines. Income is one of the, and I'm going to ask Charlotte to pop in if I'm misstating here. Income is one of the federal guidelines, but you also have to look at need. And Charlotte, do you want to speak to the other guidelines? But I think that it was the kids who might not qualify for a Head Start or an ECAP because they didn't meet the income qualifications, but there would be other ways for them to get into this program.
But not ways for them to get into a different, I'm just.
Well, I guess it would be into any title program. So if we're following the guidelines, there are
Right.
specific guidelines. So a student who may not qualify for Head Start might still qualify for a title program, one of the inclusion preschool programs or a title preschool program.
Okay. Still a little confused,
and-
but I won't belabor the point.
No.
Sorry.
So I just want to I think back to part of why I raised the both and versus either or. I think it really related to the process and the communication. So I think that the families in that existing program do need some communication. I think that there could be a benefit to providing some support to those families, just letting them know more about that transition. I think there is a general feeling that they were fairly invisible in this process. That was the word that one mother used. And I don't know what the possibility is. I wasn't suggesting that on a permanent basis. It was more of a, since this caught people by surprise, even a board director, was there an option for, continuation of another year? It's also because I know that the person that runs the King program also runs the evening preschool, which Wendy asked earlier. And so if we were to lose that individual, we also have a gap once COVID is gone and we have the flexibility. So, it's hard to lose resources or
Hard
great
to lose
assets.
talent.
Yeah.
Hard to lose talent. But that's why I've been trying to steer clear of calling it Kendra's program, because while she did start it, it is a VPS program that is offered at King. It's the King's program. And I don't want to make this about a particular person. As hard as that is, because this particular person is who this particular person is. With the concerns that I raised with my board hat on about notification, not being apprised of how the funding was going to be allocated and worked, and the fact that there wasn't an inclusion of the early learning team in this development. Those, like I said, those things give me pause for how do we avoid having this, oh my goodness moment. Oh my goodness, the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and the head didn't know it all. So
can I speak to a little bit of that, just to reinforce the fact that the early learning team was invited to all of the planning last spring. And if they were not able to come, they were the notes from the meeting and the agenda was all shared with them as well. So they were included in that. They were invited, let me put it that way. They were invited to the planning, all of the planning work.
So that would include Kelly.
Yes, Kelly was the learning specialist at the time. We also invited Kendra. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, we've drifted, and I
Sorry,
appreciate
sorry, yes, sorry, but
I appreciate everyone's patience as we've kind of meandered through this conversation. I was hopeful for a discussion. I think we've had a very weighty discussion, and I appreciate everyone's participation in that. For the presenters tonight, thank you. I'm very excited about this new program. I think I loved I'm a numbers person, so particularly the slide that had the chart, I loved it. I love to see the increased inclusion and then the expanded services that we're reaching more families. And I can personally attest to the importance of early childhood education. So this is a great step forward. And I appreciate your patience as we, I don't know, have these meanderings of thought. We know what's hard is that the work you're doing is all wonderful and we celebrate it. It's, I think it's always hard to sometimes replace something that's also good. So it's just how we balance that out. But I appreciate your patience as we thought through that. Does any other board members want to add anything in, chime in before we adjourn?
If I could just add real quick, Kyle, I just want to thank the board for this opportunity to really share the next steps. And we have heard some of the concerns that were raised, and we'll take note of that. And we appreciate your appreciation of what the work is and what work we are doing on behalf of all of our students here in Vancouver Public Schools to make sure that they all have the opportunity to benefit and to become part of our great community here in Clark County. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
thank you.
Thank you all. That is our last item on the agenda. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you and have a good night, everyone.
Good night.